The moon loomed high, pale and unblinking as the procession of vampires moved through the frozen wilderness. Cloaked figures on black horses cut through the snow like shadows, their breath curling into the night air. At the center of them, bound in silver chains, rode Princess Celine Valmont, a gift, an offering, a discarded pawn. She did not tremble. Her crimson gaze was cold, unreadable. The sharp angles of her face were carved from moonlight, framed by long waves of obsidian hair. Even in captivity, she was hauntingly beautiful, her presence as intoxicating as a forbidden spell. At the edge of the darkened forest, they were waiting. The blood-fanged wolves. A dozen towering figures stood between the trees, their golden eyes burning like embers. They were beasts in human skin, barely clothed, muscles coiled tight, their scents thick with earth, blood, and wild hunger. But it was him who held the night captive. Rael. The Alpha stepped forward, and the earth seemed to bow beneath his weight. He was massive, all raw muscle and dominance, his skin laced with scars that whispered of battles won. Dark, shoulder-length hair framed a face both ruthless and striking, his jaw strong, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, deep gold, burning with something primal, locked onto Celine with a force that sent a ripple through the cold air. He was studying her, claiming her without touching her. The vampire envoy dismounted, their leader stepping forward with false confidence. As agreed, the princess of the Valmont bloodline is yours, a peace offering between our kind. His voice was smooth, but beneath it lay unease. Even they knew offering a vampire to a werewolf was madness. Rael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he prowled forward, each step slow, deliberate. The space between them disappeared until he stood before Celine, towering over her, exuding an overwhelming presence. She should have recoiled. Any sane creature would, but Celine lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without fear. Her crimson eyes gleamed, sharp as daggers, daring him. A flicker of something dark passed through Rael's gaze, amusement, challenge, desire. Slowly, he reached out. A single clawed finger traced the delicate curve of her jaw, the brief touch searing. The scent of her, cold and sweet like midnight roses, filled his lungs, and something inside him growled in response. His voice was deep, rough with restraint. You expect me to take this willingly? Celine's lips curved into the faintest smirk. You're a beast. I thought beasts took what they wanted. A low growl rumbled from his chest. He liked her defiance. Too much. With a sharp tug, he ripped the silver chains from her wrists. The metal shattered like brittle glass, but she did not flinch. He could see it now, the way she moved like a whisper, the deadly grace in her limbs. She was no fragile thing. No, she was poison wrapped in silk, an exquisite danger. His pack shifted uneasily. To them, a vampire was an enemy, a monster. But Rael saw something else, something irresistible. Still, his voice was merciless. You belong to me now. Celine tilted her head, her red lips curving in wicked amusement. Then I hope you know how to handle your toys, wolf. A dangerous silence fell. Then, in one swift motion, Rael seized her by the waist and threw her over his shoulder. A gasp escaped her, more from surprise than fear. His grip was iron, his strength effortless, his body radiating heat. She could feel the raw power beneath his skin, the cage storm of him, and beneath it, something else, a hunger that had nothing to do with flesh and blood. Rael turned without a word, striding into the depths of the forest, taking his prize with him. Behind them, the vampire envoy watched in silence. They had sealed the deal, given her away. But none of them, not the wolves, not the vampires, not even the moon itself, knew the fire they had just unleashed. The wind howled through the towering pines as Rael carried Celine deeper into the heart of his domain. Shadows twisted between the trees, moonlight glinting off the frost-kissed ground. The scent of pine and earth clung to the night, but beneath it, the intoxicating aroma of her filled his lungs, cold, sharp, laced with something forbidden. She did not thrash in his grasp. She did not beg for release. No, she was watching him, studying him. He could feel her eyes on him, crimson and unreadable, as if she were a queen being carried by a beast rather than a captive being taken to her fate. Her voice broke through the silence, low and silken. "You enjoy this, don't you?" Rael didn't slow his pace. His grip on her waist was firm, his bare arm locked around her like iron. A wolf takes what is his. She let out a quiet hum, as if considering. "And if I refuse to be yours?" A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then you fight." The forest broke into a clearing, revealing the Bloodfang stronghold, a towering fortress of stone and timber, built against the cliffs where the wild river raged below. Fires burned in iron sconces, casting flickering light across the worn wooden gates as warriors stood watch. As Rael approached, his pack turned to him. Silence stretched, thick with tension. A vampire here. In their den, their gazes flicked to Selene, some in disgust, others in curiosity. But none dared question their alpha. Rael strode past them, stepping into the great hall where the scent of smoke and meat filled the air. The warmth of the fire did nothing to soften the icy power radiating from the woman in his arms. With one fluid motion, he set her down. Selene landed gracefully on her feet, as if she had never been touched at all. She turned to face him, her long black hair spilling over her shoulders, her pale skin almost luminous in the firelight. She lifted her wrist where his grip had been. His touch had left faint marks on her porcelain skin, a contrast of power against fragility. But she wasn't fragile. Her crimson eyes flickered with amusement. She liked this game. Rael took a slow step toward her, towering over her, the heat of his body pressing against the coldness of hers. His golden gaze burned into hers, searching for weakness. There was none. "You should be afraid," he murmured, his voice a low growl. "This is no place for a vampire." Selene tilted her head, unbothered. "And yet, here I stand." His jaw tightened. She was testing him, taunting him, and God's help him, he liked it. A sharp voice cut through the charged air. "Alpha, she cannot stay." Rael didn't turn. He knew his pack would resist this. A vampire among them was a violation of everything they stood for. But the moment he had laid eyes on her, something in him had decided. She would not be discarded. She was his. "The treaty demands it," another voice said. Rael scoffed. This was never about a treaty. The vampires had given her away not for peace, but because they saw her as worthless. A princess with no future. A woman who could bear no hairs. A curse. And yet, as Rael stared at her, his instincts screamed otherwise. His wolf recognized something in her, something that shouldn't be possible. His voice was low, but it rumbled through the hall like thunder. "She stays." A murmur rippled through the pack. Some protested, but none dared challenge him outright. Selene, for the first time, looked slightly intrigued. "Keeping me, Alpha." Her lips curved slightly. "Careful, you might get attached." His gaze darkened, jaw tightening. She was too fearless, too tempting, too dangerous. Without a word, he reached out and gripped her chin between his fingers, tilting her face up to his. A slow, shuddering tension crackled between them. Fire meeting ice. Predator meeting predator. "You belong to me now," he said, his voice rough, possessive. Selene's smile was razor-sharp. "We'll see about that." The night stretched deep and endless outside the Bloodfang stronghold. A storm whispered across the mountains, the wind carrying the scent of frost and fire. Inside the stone walls, the great hall had emptied, leaving only the flickering torches and the unspoken tension between Rael and Selene. She stood by the arched window, her fingers trailing along the cold stone, crimson eyes reflecting the moonlight. The storm had begun to swirl within her, a hunger not for blood, but for something far more dangerous. Rael leaned against the wooden table, arms crossed, watching her like a predator studying his prey. His broad frame was cast in firelight, his golden gaze unreadable yet heavy with something unspoken. "Why are you staring?" she asked, her voice soft, but edged with amusement. He pushed away from the table, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither could name. "You don't belong here," he murmured, stopping just a breath away. His heat wrapped around her, his presence overwhelming. "And yet you stand there as if you do." Selene turned to face him, her chin tilting up. Are you asking me to leave, Alpha? His jaw tightened. The way she said his title, like a dare, like a whispered temptation, sent a slow fire through his veins. No, he admitted, and that was the problem. She was too still, too controlled, but beneath the surface, he could feel it. A storm brewing, a fire waiting to burn. Celine took a step closer, defying the space he had left between them. You act like I am some fragile thing, but I see it in your eyes. She lifted a single finger, trailing it along the scar on his collarbone. Her touch was ice and silk, deadly and intoxicating. You wonder what I am. You wonder what it would be like to unravel me. Rael's breath came slow and deep, his restraint coiling tight. His hands ached to claim her, but he knew the moment he touched her with intent, there would be no turning back. I could break you, he warned, his voice like distant thunder. Celine's lips curled. Could you? His control snapped. In one swift motion, he pinned her against the stone wall, his hands braced beside her head, caging her in. Her breath hitched, but not in fear, in something far worse. Rael could hear the way her pulse quickened, the way her body recognized the predator before her. His gaze dropped to her throat, to the sharp rise and fall of her breath, to the lips that curved in dangerous amusement. You play with fire, little vampire, he growled. Celine tilted her head, exposing the delicate line of her neck, taunting him. I have never feared fire. A deep, primal sound rumbled in his chest. She wanted this game, but she didn't understand what it meant to provoke him, to stand before the beast and tempt it with something it could never have. His fingers brushed against her jaw, trailing down to her throat. He felt the chill of her skin beneath his callous touch. Cold, perfect, untouchable. And yet she leaned into it. Her breath was the softest whisper against his lips. Tell me, Alpha, she murmured, her voice like midnight silk. Is it hatred you feel for me, or something else? Rael's grip tightened against the stone. Hatred would have been easier. Hatred he could control. But this was something else entirely. The storm raged outside, howling through the mountains like a restless spirit. Inside the blood-fanged stronghold, the air crackled with something even more untamed, a force neither vampire nor werewolf could name. Rael hadn't moved. He still stood before Celine, his hands caging her against the cold stone wall, his breath thick with restraint. Every inch of him was tense, coiled, as if one wrong move would shatter the last fragile thread of his control. And Celine knew it. She lifted a delicate hand, fingers like ice as they traced along his forearm, her touch light, teasing. His muscles flexed beneath her fingertips, heat rolling off his skin in waves. Such raw power, such perfect danger. You're holding back, she murmured, crimson eyes gleaming. Why? Rael let out a slow, shuddering breath. She was testing him, tempting the beast she should have feared. His golden eyes burned into hers. Because I don't trust myself with you. Celine smiled then, a slow, wicked curve of her lips. What makes you think I want you to? His restraint snapped. With a low growl, he seized her wrist and pinned it above her head. His grip was firm, unyielding, his body pressing into hers, heat against cold. A gasp slipped from her lips, not of fear, but of something deeper, something dark and thrilling. You think this is a game? Rael's voice was rough, his breath warm against her throat. Celine's pulse was steady, unshaken. No, she whispered. I think it's fate. Rael's jaw clenched. Fate. That word burned through him like wildfire. He had spent his life hating her kind, despising everything they stood for. And yet, here he was, his body betraying him, his instincts screaming for him to take what should never be his. Celine moved, not to escape, but to push closer. The silk of her dress brushed against his bare chest, and the coldness of her skin only made his heat burn hotter. You fight it, she whispered, her voice a seductive spell. But I hear your heart, wolf. It beats louder when I'm near. Rael let out a low, rumbling growl, his forehead nearly touching hers. Damn her. Damn this pull. His free hand brushed against her throat, feeling the unnatural stillness beneath her skin. She was untouchable, immortal, forbidden. And yet, when his fingers traced her jaw, she shivered. Careful, he murmured, his voice a warning. I don't play gently. Celine exhaled a slow, wicked breath. Who asked you to? The fire between them burned dangerously bright. Rael's grip tightened, his restraint hanging by a thread. He had taken her as a captive, a bargaining piece in a war older than either of them. But this moment was something else entirely. Not a bargain, not a battle. Something raw, something unspoken. A war not of claws and fangs, but of hunger, temptation, and a desire neither could afford to feel. Celine tilted her head, pressing one last taunt into the thick silence. What will you do, Alpha? Rael's golden eyes darkened, the wolf inside him snarling for release. He did not answer. He only let the storm rage on. The fire crackled in the dimly lit chamber, its glow casting flickering shadows against the stone walls. The storm outside had not quieted, but inside the stronghold, another storm brewed, one far more dangerous. Rael stood with his back to Celine, fists clenched at his sides. His breath came slow and measured, his muscles coiled tight. He needed distance. He needed control. But she wasn't giving him either. Celine moved with the grace of a phantom, silent as she stepped toward him. The scent of her, dark and laced with something forbidden, wrapped around him, poisoning his resolve. You pretend to be unaffected, she murmured. He didn't turn. He couldn't. You think too highly of yourself. She let out a quiet hum, stopping just a breath away. Do I? The tension between them was a living thing, stretching between shadow and fire. Rael had always prided himself on discipline, on his ability to rule his instincts rather than be ruled by them. But Celine, she was anarchy in its most beautiful form. He felt the whisper of her fingers before she touched him, hovering just above his skin, taunting him with the cold promise of something he shouldn't crave. Then she did it, a single touch. Her fingertips grazed his bare shoulder, trailing along the ridges of muscle, light as silk yet leaving fire in their wake. Rael inhaled sharply, his body reacting before his mind could stop it. He caught her wrist in an iron grip, spinning to face her in one swift, predatory motion. Golden eyes met crimson, heat met ice. You test me, he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Celine didn't flinch. She never did. Instead, her lips curled into a knowing smile. I provoke what is already there. His jaw tensed, his grip on her tightening. She was pushing him toward an edge, daring him to fall. And damn him, he wanted to. Her free hand came up, brushing against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, the steady, powerful rhythm betraying him. Tell me, Rael, she whispered, her voice dipping into something dark, something meant to pull him deeper. What do you want? His control shattered. In one swift motion, he pushed her back against the stone pillar, his body caging hers in. His breath was heavy, his presence overwhelming, a storm barely contained. You ask dangerous questions, little vampire, he murmured. Celine's lashes lowered, but her smile remained. And you give dangerous answers. He exhaled roughly. This was a war and he was losing. He leaned in, not touching her, but so close she could feel the heat of him against her frozen skin. His hands braced on either side of her, trapping her without ever laying a claim. Celine tilted her chin, her voice nothing but a whisper between them. If you fear what you want, Alpha, perhaps you were never meant to have it. The beast in him snarled. She was wrong. He didn't fear what he wanted. He feared what he might do to get it. His golden gaze darkened, a silent promise lingering in the space between them. This was no longer a question of power, no longer a battle of dominance. It was a slow descent into madness, one neither of them wanted to escape. The wind howled beyond the stronghold, rattling against the ancient stone, but inside, Rael could only hear her. Celine stood before him, her crimson eyes gleaming in the dim light, her body still caged between his and the cold pillar. She was untouchable, forbidden. Yet everything in him screamed to claim her. His breath was heavy, his hands braced against the stone beside her head. He was too close, too consumed. And Celine? She wasn't afraid. She lifted a single hand, resting it against the center of his chest. The contact was ice and fire, a deadly contrast. Rael stiffened, every muscle in his body locking down, but he did not pull away. "You fight it," she whispered, "but your body betrays you." His jaw clenched. "You think this is a game, vampire?" Celine's lips curved. "No, I think it's inevitable." She leaned in, her cool breath ghosting over his skin. The sharp scent of her, dark, intoxicating, utterly wrong, wrapped around him, unraveling the last of his restraint. Rael moved before he could stop himself. His hand caught her wrist, his fingers curling around the delicate bones like a silent warning. She didn't flinch. She never did. His free hand lifted, brushing against her throat, so close to something vital, something fragile, yet she stood still beneath his touch, trusting him, daring him. He let out a slow breath, his thumb tracing the elegant line of her jaw. "You are playing with fire, Celine." Her gaze darkened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then burn me." Something inside him snapped. Rael pressed against her, his heat overwhelming, his presence inescapable. His body was rigid with restraint, yet his grip on her was possessive, as if she already belonged to him. Celine exhaled softly, her fingers trailing up his arm, her touch feather-light, yet deliberate. Tempting, seductive, dangerous. "You hold yourself back," she murmured, her voice like silk and shadows. "Why?" Rael let out a low growl, the sound rough, raw, primal. "Because I don't trust myself with you." Celine's smile was slow, wicked. "And if I do?" His fingers curled against the stone, his restraint hanging by a thread. Everything in him told him to walk away, to break this pull before it destroyed them both. But then she whispered, so softly that it barely reached him, "Let go, Rael." And the beast inside him obeyed. In a blur, he spun her away from the pillar, pulling her against him. His grip was firm, unrelenting, a silent promise of something deeper. Celine gasped, but it wasn't in fear. It was in surrender. Rael's golden eyes burned into hers, his hands locked at her waist, his breath rough against her cool skin. The storm outside could tear the world apart, but nothing could match the storm inside them. Celine lifted a hand, her fingers brushing against his jaw, her touch a contradiction, soft yet unyielding, cold yet searing. For the first time in his life, Rael was powerless. Not because she was stronger, not because she had forced his hand, but because he had already fallen. And there was no turning back. The air between them was thick, charged with something primal, something neither of them could deny. The storm outside lashed against the stronghold, the wind howling through the mountains like a beast mourning the inevitable. But inside, another storm raged, silent, smoldering, waiting to consume them both. Rael still held Celine against him, his grip firm, unrelenting. His body burned, but her skin was cool, a perfect contradiction, a deadly balance. She was his opposite, his enemy, his ruin. And yet, the way she looked at him, as if she already owned him, made something dark stir inside him. "You should run," he murmured, his voice a low growl. Celine's lips curved, slow and knowing. "Would you let me?" His golden eyes burned into hers. No, he wouldn't. He exhaled sharply, his hands tightening on her waist, feeling the delicate curve of her beneath his touch. Everything about her was meant to destroy him. And still, he wanted more. Celine tilted her head, watching him with a kind of dangerous amusement. "Your hands say one thing," she whispered, "but your eyes." She trailed a single finger up his chest, feeling the rigid muscle beneath burning skin. "They say something else." Rael's jaw tensed. She was right. His body had already betrayed him. With a sudden motion, he spun her, pressing her back against the cold stone wall. The impact sent a shot through her, but she didn't flinch. She never did. Rael leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you know me, Celine?" Her crimson eyes glowed in the dim light, her expression unreadable. "I know what you are." He let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "Then you know what happens next." Celine exhaled softly, her fingers ghosting along his forearm, teasing, testing, unafraid. "I know what should happen." She let the words settle between them, dark and full of promise. "But I also know you." Rael's grip on her tightened. She was playing a dangerous game. but so was he. His hand slid down her arms, slow, deliberate, mapping every inch of her before stopping at her wrists. He lifted them, pressing them against the stone, locking her in place. She let him. His golden eyes flickered to her lips, and something deep inside him snapped. Celine felt it, the shift, the surrender, the moment when the beast inside him decided. There would be no turning back. A slow, wicked smile curved her lips. You are not as strong as you pretend to be, Alpha. Rael let out a rough breath, his forehead nearly touching hers. And you are not as untouchable as you think. She arched a perfect brow. Then touch me. A challenge, a dare. Rael's grip on her wrist tightened, his heart pounding like war drums in his chest. Damn her. Damn this pull. The fire in his veins was undeniable now, the war between instinct and reason already lost. Celine leaned forward, her cool lips brushing just against his jaw, her voice a whisper of dark silk. You are always going to be mine. Rael's control shattered. With a snarl, he let go. The storm outside raged. But inside, they were the storm. The storm outside reached its peak, the wind howling like a wounded beast. But inside the stronghold, another storm raged, one far more dangerous. Rael had abandoned all reason. Celine had never needed it. Their bodies were too close, too entwined in this dance of dominance and surrender. Rael's grip on her wrists remained firm, pressing her against the cold stone. But Celine didn't fight him. She held his gaze, her crimson eyes gleaming, daring him to take what they both knew was inevitable. You've crossed the line, Alpha, she whispered. Rael's breath came ragged, his golden eyes glowing with something untamed. You dragged me over it. Celine exhaled softly, the ghost of a smile curling at the edges of her lips. She had won. Or perhaps they both had lost. His fingers slid down her wrists, moving slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing the feel of her beneath his touch. She was cold, but she burned him all the same. I should hate you, he murmured, his voice rough with something unspoken. Celine tilted her head, her lips just inches from his. Then hate me. Rael let out a low, rumbling growl. She wanted to break him. And she had. His hands moved to her waist, fingers tightening as if to anchor himself, to keep from losing control entirely. But the moment he touched her, control was a meaningless thing. Celine's hands lifted, trailing up his arms, over the powerful ridges of the shoulders, until her fingers tangled in his dark hair. Possessive, claiming. Rael stiffened. No one touched him like that. No one dared. Except her. Always her. A shudder ran through him, his breath hot against her skin. She was his ruin, and she knew it. Celine's voice was a whisper in the dark. You feel it, don't you? Rael's hands flexed, his restraint barely holding. She was pushing him to the edge. I feel nothing, he lied. Celine's smile was slow, wicked. Liar. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his jaw, her fangs just barely grazing his skin. A warning, a promise. Rael's pulse thundered, his body coiled tight like a predator on the verge of attack. He had never wanted anything more. And that was the true danger, because she wasn't his to want. A distant sound shattered through the silence, the clang of metal, the heavy thud of boots against stone. Rael's head snapped up. The scent hit him first. Iron, power, fury. The Vampire King. Celine's body tensed against him, her eyes flickering with something sharp and unreadable. They had been found. Rael's grip on her tightened for a single heartbeat, as if he could keep her. But he couldn't. And now they would burn for this. Celine exhaled, her fingers brushing over his chest in a fleeting touch, one that said everything they could never say aloud. Then she stepped away. The moment shattered. Rael's hands curled into fists as he watched her. Asterisk, asterisk, his greatest temptation, his inevitable downfall. Asterisk, asterisk, walked toward the darkness. She didn't look back. And yet, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.